Okay, so good evening, everyone. We are about to get going on our next talk. It's probably one of the biggest taboos, and we're going to be talking about death and what happens when you die. It is a subject, I don't know about you guys, that most people are very aware of, that is not in their periphery. It's not something they think about a lot. And it becomes a great awakening if someone has death thrust upon them. It is a great awakening, either if it is a fright that they have in their own lives with facing their own mortality, or they lose someone very, very close to them. So that is the subject that we're going to be taking on. And I think my favorite thing about death is that actually nobody has any idea. It has been for all of history an absolute enigma, and I believe it always will be. And I think that's what excites me is, and even though it's an enigma, one would think that there's no way that you can open up the subject in a way that can leave you feeling very peaceful because of the fact that you can't solve the enigma. But I'm going to challenge that we're going to use a little bit of open-heartedness and logic and actually realize that death is actually holding the secrets and its mystery wide open for anyone who actually wants to feel and experience, which can really help us, because right at the beginning, I'm going to remind us that Carl Jung used to believe that the fear of death, or the fact that we know that we are fast daily approaching our very demise and end into the dark black, is something that is affecting every single action of our lives, the way we speak, the way we do things. Now, if he's correct, that is a massive, massive, conversation to have. So therefore, this very light-hearted chat about death can actually be quite life-changing. Now, right from the beginning, can you imagine us standing on the plains? Can you imagine standing in these grasslands tens of thousands of years ago and just being aware of the fact of the rise and the fall of death? And just like all animals, we lose partners and we lose family members, and we're not sure at what stage we began to become very aware of this process. But what we do know is that mythology around death is as old as death itself. And what I mean by that is we have been telling stories about death since the very beginning. Now, to look into the mythology of death is very, very powerful, and we're not going to take a dive into it tonight, but I invite you to do it in your own scope. And why I invite you to do that is I find it very interesting that in all cultures, we began to tell very similar stories about what it is that happens after death. Now, many of you know I've mentioned someone called Joseph Campbell before. Now, Joseph Campbell, a man who wrote books like A Hero of a Thousand Faces, he had this incredible theory that I believe has been proved over and over. And what his theory was that the psyche within man, or the archetypes that exist within the universe, within man, within the intelligence of an acorn, within an atom, within the rise and fall of the sun, what he was essentially saying is that there is a story that is growing within everything and unfolding, and that story will retell itself in purity in every culture in a different way. Now, if you're not sure what I just said, another way of putting it is that he showed that even Indian tribes that were completely isolated, that had never ever been influenced by Christian Gnostics or by Rosicrucians, or their actual birth and death stories told very, very similar things. Now, you would straight away ask yourself, well, that doesn't sound true at all, because their stories are different. Actually, they're not. What you see in all stories across culture for tens of thousands of years is the story of how there are certain themes. And what are those themes? There is the calling of basically having to face this difficult thing. In this case, it would be death. And the hero's journey is the descending into the darkness and facing whatever it is that you have to do and rising from the other side. Now, what this has to do with mythology is that for some reason, most cultures have decided that there is a rebirth. Most cultures have decided that there is some form of transformation. There is some form of ascension. There is some sort of cycle of, let's call it almost, what do you call it when things are, I can't think of the word right now. So that just starts us off with mythology. Let's use a simple example. Let's look at the Vikings. Now, to be powerful in the conversation of death, you cannot be powerful in the conversation of death unless you understand that death is almost one of the only immutables. It is an absolute fact. You are right now counting down as though you have a clock or a counter in your chest. You are literally, it's going counting down as you're breathing, and you are facing your death. We don't know when, but it's an immutable. Now, you can imagine how long this has been scaring people. And what I find so incredible is when we look at the Vikings, for interest, and we dive into their mythology, we like to think, wow, that's so barbaric, you know, that I'm going to base my entire life on the way that I die. And if we think about it a little bit and we take the short journey, we're going to begin to realize that they might be far more enlightened than we are. Knowing, first of all, that we are going to die. I think in some of the things I'm going to suggest, I would like us to possibly draw the conclusion that preparing for a good death is almost everything that birth is about. But that's quite a bold statement. Now, I don't know how much you know about the Vikings. Some of it has been glorified and not a lot of it has been twisted and turned. There's some very interesting facts that are not that known in movies and things like that. And that is, for instance, that the Vikings had a lot of female warriors. And that's not expressed all that clearly in modern movies. We know this because when we look on the battlefields, something like 40% of the, I suppose you could call them, not really carcasses, the skeletons are actually of female warriors. But why we're talking about Vikings is that a Viking essentially really hoped to die on the battlefield. And they really believed that the way that they actually faced death was going to change everything about the afterlife. And we could go into the Egyptians. The Egyptians literally believed that every moment of what you were doing right now, you were building into your afterlife. So mythology aside, it's something that we can study. Where that leaves us is, I want us to start unpacking how we could actually know the truth about death. So imagine actually using logic. It sounds very interesting, but there is something for thousands of years, many of you have heard me speak about this. It's called cosmic law, or it's called natural law. And it is something that nearly every single ancient scholar of the mystery school spoke about. Pythagoras, Galileo, I mean, there's a list, even up to Isaac Newton, all the Masonic orders, all the Hermetics, they all believed in one thing in common, and that was what the ancient Egyptians gave us, which is natural law. Now, that sounds very intellectual, but let's actually look at natural law and what it has to death. Natural law is the fact that the entire universe is actually unfolding in a series of perfect cycles that is driven by some divine entity or intelligence that is so beyond our understanding, but that it all works in a perfect evolution that we gradually become more and more aware of as it unfolds. Now, that seems theoretical, but actually the whole world around you is proving the secrets of death. Let me prove it to you. Let's begin with the ocean. The ocean goes in and it goes out every single day. The ocean gets storms, and it really does appear that if you're on the beach and you're watching the ocean, it really does appear that you are watching one section, but actually that is just part of an entire ocean. But what do we see there? The receding, the pushing. Now that's just the ocean. Let's travel anywhere around reality. Let's go towards the sun. What is the sun doing? The sun, according to natural law, cosmic law, whatever you want to call it, all the mystery schools were showing how everything is inbuilt in a birth, rebirth, death, rebirth cycle. We see the sun rise every single morning, and we see the sun hit a pinnacle of its youth and its beauty and its glory. And then we see the sun go down again. And as the sun begins to move into darkness, we would never for a second doubt that after a period of absolute silence, that the sun begins to be born again. Let's move into what the sun is affecting. See, none of this is belief. I'm just discussing natural law to open those centers in your mind to realize there is no secret here. And while the sun is doing this, we go into the fields and we have flowers that every single season recede into absolute frost-bitten death and then begin to emerge with the first warmth, breaking through the darkness of the soil, just as it has for hundreds and thousands of years, and begins to emerge, slightly changed, slightly evolved, slightly more beautiful each time. And while this is going on, the planet is turning completely predictably with the darkness and the light. And what's so incredible about this is no matter where we look, we begin to understand that we are amidst or thrust in the birth of life and the birth of death and the interwovenness of it all the time. Even if we move back onto a galactic level, wow, the secrets are there. Stars, we are at a point where we can see stars collapsing into themselves, into literally, according to physics, absolute nothingness, and then burst back into life. Now, I talk about stars, that's probably galaxies is the biggest thing I can talk about. But this is what's so beautiful about our hermetic laws, about as above, so below. If the stars or the galactic levels are showing us that, let's look at the smallest thing we know. We look at an atom. And what do we know in science? It's absolutely fascinating that if you go right to the basement of reality, if you magnify things to the most you can, you eventually end up with something that looks like a particle. And there's also a wave, and the wave is potential energy, and the particle means there is something there. And for some reason, they keep changing. So another way of putting this is that reality pops in and out of existence. This is at the smallest level. Galaxies do this too. And they have no idea where a particle goes when it pops in and out of existence. They've got a lot of theories, and these are scientists, not spirituality individuals. They've got theories like there's other dimensions, or maybe it goes. But I mean, I'm not even talking about death. I've literally just been discussing the reality around us, the natural laws that the ancient wisdoms have given us. And to me, my mind's already going, well, I think it's pretty obvious what's going on here. But let's personalize it a little bit. Some of the most ancient teachings that we have are the Vedic teachings and the deep Eastern philosophies. And I want us to think about that, the great being of Kali, who creates the universes with the in-breath and the out-breath. It's exactly the same thing. And I hope that this is all starting, it's a very strange conversation, but this should start enlightening you on death. And I'm talking about this idea that Kali is this being that is breathing in and out galaxies. And as these galaxies unfold and they hit their massive evolution, and then it's breathed back in. And while I'm doing that, what are you doing right now? You are doing the exact same thing. You are birthing and you are dying. Your breath is going in and out, just like Kali's as we speak. Now, some people might go, I have no freaking idea what this guy's going on about. What does this have to do about death? But I believe that if you're really connecting into what I'm saying, you're already understanding how there is no mystery. So we continue, we're thinking about this great being of Kali. And do you know that in some parts of Hebrew, there's this belief that the sound of God is even the sound of your breath. That in other words, every time you breathe, you're saying the name of God. So beautiful. So we were talking about Jung, so let's get personal. That was very cosmic. But to me, it's like it answers everything I need to know, just by sitting on the beach and watching the universe. So Jung is suggesting we're walking around with these anxieties and these panic disorders, fighting with our spouses. Let's get out of the stars. Let's talk about our lives now. And it's all because we're terrified that we're going to die. And on some days we're aware that's why we're acting like we're acting. We're screaming at some arsehole in the traffic. So frustrated. And it's all apparently, according to certain areas of psychology, that's because you're going to die and you don't know what to do about it and you're freaking terrified. Now, one wonders if he's got a point. And then we start thinking, okay, what's the most ancient system of knowledge that we have? Is shamanism. What is the basis of shamanism? The basis of shamanism is to die. Now, that sounds like a really bold statement, but think about it. Basically, shamanism was to put you into an altered state through dancing, breath work, fasting, deprivation, psychedelics, to the point where a certain part of your brain starts to shut down, and that part of your brain is identity. And as that part of your brain dies, you experience, most people, some form of panic, some form of, I'm losing touch, I'm losing control, reality's dissolving, boom, and then there's absolute peace. And if you've ever been to an altered state, it could have been through breath work, it could have been through hours of prayer, hours of dancing. Once you're through that discomfort, you're in this nothing. And most people report that when you're in that cosmic bliss of nothing, that all the questions they had prepared to bring to the side don't make any sense. They're just in a timeless, absolute perfection. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, shamanism, essentially, a lot of you guys have heard of, well, now I can't even think of his name, but there's a lot of very powerful authors that have written about what shamans do. But think about it, the idea in shamanism, Terence McKenna mentioned this, many people mentioned this, is to die before you die so that you can live. There are so many versions of that statement for the last few thousand years. To die before you die so that you can live. And why? So that you can realize just how natural death is and realize what is on the other side of it. And therefore, for thousands of years, we've held this process of initiation where people at some stage can face, doesn't mean that they have to have this terrifying experience into ecstatic oblivion. Maybe they have that, but it could just be something that makes them see through the smallness of self-perception, of being completely based on your own juxtaposition. In other words, only seeing things through your perspective. So therefore, initiation has been removed and it's left us quite terrified because most of us don't get a chance to ever see reality through a different lens. And essentially what happens in shamanism is these people become dream walkers. And that word simply means that they cross between the threshold of the physical and the unphysical quite easily. And in truth, you do this every single night of your life. You move from the physical expression of the archetypal divine essence of the entire universe into the ethereal, imaginative, creative, flowing, ever-evolving aspect. And these two are the perfect mirror of each other. And they've been growing off each other for billions of years. Now, do you know why I bring up dreams? Dreams is another proof of the fact that death is but simply a transition that keeps happening to you. Do you know how? Have you ever been through a stage where, for instance, you are doing a lot of drugs or a lot of religion or a lot of dancing or a lot of chess. Now, this sounds really strange how I'm saying this. And that begins to bleed into your dreams and your lucid life. And do you know what? Some people say, well, obviously, because it's just your brain firing. No, you are in your physical body and you also have an entire soul and an unconscious, and they are constantly influencing each other, just like the past is constantly influencing the future, which is so hard for us to understand. But what I'm actually saying is your actions in the physical actually create how your dreams evolve. If you're going through a stage where all you do is party and you take drugs, and that starts to influence your dreams, and your dreams become quite dark and you make quite strange decisions. Most people have experienced this. Or you're in your period of your life where you're very scared, you don't have money, you're worried about where your next meal's going to come from. That bleeds a lot into your dreams. But vice versa, what you're doing in that ethereal dream world affects your physical life. This is my way of trying to prove to you through your dreams just how normal death is. How do we know what I'm saying is true? Well, even in modern psychology, people are treating trauma through dreams. So they teach people to wake up in their dreams and realize, oh, this thing's chasing me. Well, you know what? I'm not taking the shit anymore. And a lot of people have had this experience in their lives where they've always been terrified when something has happened in their dreams, or when they have a lucid dream, or when they get sleep paralysis. And later on in life, we get to the point where we're just not afraid anymore. And one day you turn around inside this dream and you start chasing this thing back, and suddenly it turns into a teddy bear, and you wonder why this thing has tormented you your whole life. What is my point? That again, we're seeing how what's happening in the non-physical bleeds into the physical, and the physical bleeds into the non-physical. So actually, another way of putting this is the breakthroughs you make in your physical life affect your soul constantly, and the breakthroughs you make in your soul change your physical life constantly. But another way of saying this is that you can evolve once you are dead to affect how you are going to come back once you are physical, just like how once you are physical, you can evolve or affect what's going to happen once you're dead. It's magnificent. Just like how do you know? Well, because it's happening every day with your dreams. If you're in a powerful space, you're doing a lot of mantras, not because mantras are the answer, because it makes you feel good, and you're having your beach walks and you're feeling good about your body, starts influencing your dreams, and the whole thing starts balancing out. And the balance is always retrievable. Cool. A lot of angles that we're coming at this. And I would go as far as to say that your relationship to death is probably the biggest decision you'll ever make. Now, what if I told you that if you could bring death up at least once a week, it could completely change your life? Do you know that one of the reasons why death can be a path to enlightenment is because your relationship to death will show you how close you are to your spirit? And I'll put that in very simplistic terms. If you started having breathing problems, or you have an anxiety attack, or suddenly you think that you might be ill, maybe all of us that have this experience. So we're not talking about losing other people at the moment. We're just talking about yourself, and you suddenly realize you might be at the end. It has been reported in nearly every study done that people are far more terrified if they are unhappy at that moment with the recent decisions they've been making. I mean, that's mind-blowing. In other words, if you're in a really messed up state and you're very guilty about the things that you're doing, and you just don't feel in alignment, and suddenly, so your life's spinning out, and you go to bed at night and you think, what am I doing? And at night, you suddenly start having chest pains. People report that they are so much more terrified. And this has been tested in multiple ways. Their anxiety is higher. They freak out more. Now, I'm not saying that they should, but why would that be? Because actually, it's almost like a beautiful litmus test. Another way of putting this is your relationship with death is a very honest way, without any bull, of telling you how you really feel about how you are doing. What would the opposite of this be? That you are making beautiful decisions, you're finally making breakthroughs, you've taken on those addictions that have been driving you crazy, you're not hurting people the way you used to. It doesn't matter what your thing was. And you actually starting to feel spiritually good about who you are, and you're sitting in a cinema and suddenly you have a pain in your chest, or something doesn't feel right, and just for a second it crosses your mind. You will still be scared, but most people report there's a part of them that are like, I hope my family's going to be okay. But there is so much more courage there. And that's such an extraordinary thing that I'm actually suggesting. I'm suggesting that every time you sit down in meditation and ask yourself at that moment, how am I feeling about death right now? It will give you a very, very honest reflection. I would almost go as far as to say that it gives you like a true north. And it's an incredible thing because it thinks of the Vikings again. And actually, we are preparing to die. One of the most powerful meditations you can ever do is lie on your back and actually imagine that you are at the end and look back at your life. And until you can find what makes you look back and be able to die with a smile, you keep repeating the meditation. So even if you think you're going to die in 1 year's time, maybe someone in this room is on their last legs. You keep doing the meditation. And if you're looking back and you look at what it is you've done and you're still in that, no, I can't let go, then you are still not finding the gift that death has for you. But if you eventually are lying there and you look back and you find the smile of what it is you've done, that's how you find that purpose that is kind of in death. You could almost say that death can keep us honest. On a more personal level, we have very high anxieties and we are very afraid of what death might be. Now, why I had this conversation backwards, I spoke to you about the universe, was because it gives you an ease when you realize that actually there's not that great mystery. And what one begins to actually realize, and most people can, especially spiritual people, admit this, they're actually more afraid of suffering. They are actually more afraid of being ill. And they're actually more afraid of what it would feel like to die. Because what do you remember of what it was like before you were born? Well, you might have cosmic memory, but actually just peace. There is nothing because you were in that zone of the sun and of the plant. And so the idea of actually fearing once you slip across the mortal coil, there's actually nothing, there's no reason to. The fears tend to lie in actually suffering and actually being ill. And it's quite an amazing thing how we have demonized being sick, as though we are not supposed to get sick and as though we are not supposed to suffer. You know, the most incredible thing is some of the great philosophers of our time have actually proven that, I actually do it right now. Let's do an exercise. I want to give you the opportunity to live forever. I want to know if you're going to take it. But before you answer, just think about it for a second. So you can have your complete mortality, like you never have to face death. All this conversations is probably making you anxious. Some of the things I'm saying, it's done. You don't have to face death. And what the great philosophers have shown, that nearly, Pythagoras went on about this, nearly every one of his students eventually said they would choose death. And it was quite interesting when he asked them when they would choose death, most of them eventually decided that the timeline was pretty right. Now, what's amazing about that is the beauty of things completely disappear if death is not really something. And what's amazing is how we spoke about those rising and those falling cycles. Do you know how important in your eternal development, in this beautiful tapestry that you are creating, this unique being that has been part of your this mosaic that you are creating, do you know that a very big, important part of that process is the childlike essence? Think about when you're a child. These are the processes that your soul keeps going through. When you're a child, you have the innocent purity. You remember being a child? And the other thing about innocent purity is that you are fully immersed. A child does not know anything other than what it's experiencing. That's why a lot of trauma can happen there, but the beauty that can happen. And think about how that changes through life. By the time you are slightly older, you become wise, hopefully, and detached. Now think about that process, and then back into the darkness, and coming back, and then back fully immersed innocence. If we didn't have that cleansing of the lenses of perception, or that return to innocence, or purity, or that rebirth, well, then the process wouldn't work properly. Just like that little bud starts to break through into the light, that bud was and is an acorn tree. It's so powerful when you start to realize how important the process is. So where that leaves us is that I do think that most people, if they meditate on it, actually realize that even if they don't believe that there is the obvious cycle after death and that you are just going to continue, even if you believe there's nothing is absolute peace. It is only the imagination that is hijacked by time that could believe that there's some form of suffering after death. Only the imagination. Because all the things of suffering that you think about are time-based, are absolutely time-based. So where that leaves us in this conversation is, let's look at contrast, right? So I tried to prove death to you. You might not be convinced just yet that death is not the end. How do you know that you exist? Right now, I'm sitting here and I think I'm Nathan. I've got the story of my inner world and I've got this idea of who my personality is. The only reason I have any concept of me is because Diane's sitting there and I have an idea of what I think she is. And there's Chris sitting over there. So another way of putting this is, I only have an inner because there's an outer. Okay, so, okay, that seems quite logical. There's a light shining on my face. The only reason that there's a light shining on my face and that I know that it's a light is because I know what darkness is. There is absolutely no ways that that light can exist without darkness existing. This is also like ancient mystery schools. This is science even. The contrasts exist. What does this have to do with death? There is absolutely no ways you can die if your life doesn't exist. There is no ways you can live if your death doesn't exist. This is an ancient process that you've been involved in for so long, and just go pick up a book. Most spiritual organizations know this. They have different versions of what you should be doing and how you should be growing, but it's written in the stars. These are secrets that are told everywhere for anyone who will sit and meditate underneath an acorn tree. So the contrast of the fact that I think there's an out, the fact that I think the world has nothing to do with me. There's certain Mahayana Buddhists that believe the world is your soul. It's just your external version of your soul. So contrast is a very, very powerful way to realize how the fact that what appears to be something isolated, death cannot be on its own. It's just not possible. Light cannot be on its own. My inner world cannot be on its own. It's a real joke about loneliness and fear, and the only reason I can perceive myself totally alone is because the entire universe is outside of me, one with me. It's quite a paradox, isn't it? And you know what's quite funny is I was at a ceremony recently where there was this beautiful chandelier above me with all these light bulbs on all over. And I was lying on my back listening to the singing, and I watched one of the light bulbs go out. And I remember thinking, you know, this is absolutely so much like death. And what's so interesting is that light bulb has died now, right? There's the current running through this whole thing. And if you go and change that light bulb now, the exact same current runs back into the light bulb. And really, that's why it is so hard to actually decide exactly what's going on, because the greatest mystery of our time is not actually whether you are going to continue forever. You will. This is the debate, and the Buddhists have been talking about this for thousands of years. The only debate for anyone with the form of enlightenment is, listen to this sentence, how much of your identity will you keep? That's the only debate. And that is a difficult one for us because we are very based in our mind. Now, what was the occult solution to this? And for people that get terrified when I use that word, I mean, what was the ancient knowledge? They decided, and the, what do you call them? The New Agers have taken this all from them, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that. They decided that you have a mental body, you have an emotional body. This makes sense to me. You have a soul and you have a physical body, right? The four bodies. Some organizations believed it was three. There was mind, body, soul. Some organizations believed there was the emotional body as well. But it makes sense to me, and they believed that each one of those things was on its own process of evolution. A very interesting person to listen to with this is Rudolf Steiner, but you're going to need months to listen and study him. It's beautiful. So I'm just bringing that up to say that, quite simply, the light bulbs blew my mind because it made me think of what they've always been debating. And I mean, before you can actually answer that question, you have to ask yourself, because if Nazi's going to decide, okay, I really want to think about this death conversation, I'm going to meditate on what Nathan's saying, she can't actually decide what part of her continues unless she answers this question. And this is why death is a path to enlightenment. She has to answer the question of, well, then who am I? So if I have to say, I wonder how much of Nathan continues, well, then who is Nathan? What is Nathan? Then I sit there in meditation and I'm going, well, what am I saying? Like, is it my thoughts that continue? Does that mean I'm my thoughts? No, I don't think my thoughts continue. I think it's what my essence is. What's my essence? Well, my essence must be what I am when I'm not thinking. Okay, well, that's just peace. That's what I imagine it's like when I'm dead. And that's when I become the potential energy. Nothing's happening. Just like my heartbeat, here it comes, and now I start thinking, and I'm alive. Oh, so which one is identity? I don't know how many of you are understanding this, but it's mind-blowing. So then you sit there again, you're like, yeah, but I mean, like Buddha said, like, which part of me continues? So you meditate deeper, and you realize that you're really scared, because what if I die and I end? Who's I? What is I? What ends? Well, it must be the things I own. Well, I know it's not that. Maybe it's my personality. My personality is changing all the time. I can't answer this question for you, but it's so beautiful and it's so exciting. And what you eventually realize in your own way is that when you're very silent in meditation, you die for a little while. Nothing happens. You just don't have, think about what doctors know, right? They measure your ECG, your EKGs, all of those things. All that's saying is, I'm in a period of activity. I'm in a period of activity into meditation. Nothing, pure. And you lose it, and you're thinking again, and you're thinking again. You didn't lose identity. You just cease to be for a short while in the way that you know yourself to be separate. Ooh, the subject. So to close off, what is my personal experience of, besides this intellectual dive into death? Well, some of you know that since I have been a child, I keep waking up next to my body, and it was terrifying. There's nothing romantic about it. Nowadays, I love it. I have such fun. But it was really scary. I mean, as a little boy, I used to always wake up and I was back in the room, but I hadn't got back in my body yet. And why I bring this up is I have proved to me in my own life that I'm not my body. And that means that, coupled with the intellectual conversation, this observational conversation, and to me, all we need to know is literally evolving and revolving around us. So I feel like a personal experience on the fact that I know I'm not my body, and I know that I can feel without my body. That's always what fascinated me as a child, is that when I would float out of my body and I would get such a fright, and obviously eventually I learned to have fun, but what always fascinated me is when I was out of my body and I was looking down at myself lying in bed, and then I would think about it, like I would think, geez, my skin looks strange, and I would think to myself, now who's thinking? Now, how can I be thinking if thinking comes from my brain? It's a very interesting thing. And a lot of people that do lucid dreaming, or we spoke about dream walkers, or people that have been out of their bodies or have had a near NDE, near-death experience, well, what do they explain? They explain that while they were floating in the theater above their body, I mean, there's thousands of books about this, and they looked down at their own body and the doctors trying to save them. They had emotions about what was happening. They had thoughts about what was happening, which tells you what? That your emotional body, your mental body, and your spirit have got nothing to do with only firing because of your physical body, which takes us really to the end. What that would prove to us is that we are in a state of constant evolution. What we are evolving to become, I have no idea. But I do know that in my own perception, the universe has an incredible ethos, a morality. I know that sounds really strange. People think that the universe is cold and doesn't care. You know, when you think of a parent, if a parent were to create a set of rules for its children, those rules at certain stage, especially when the children keep running into certain things, would appear quite cruel. But the only reason why a parent would enforce those laws was because it knew that the child was going to grow into the most magnificent thing if those rules were enforced, like going to bed, dying, waking up, learning how to have a better day, dying, waking. It's such a vast conversation, but my simple point is that the universe is not cold. The universe is just beyond our understanding on how perfect it is. And when you start to connect to that, the way things are is absolute love of God guiding us, then things become quite exciting, because how different would you behave from right now if you, instead of thinking your life is coming to an end, started to realize that the book you read right next, or the breakthrough you make soon, or the love you give to someone is actually part of your eternal process? Maybe you are already 60 or dying, or maybe you are 100, or how different, maybe you are in your 30s and you think, oh, my life just hasn't gone. How different would it be if you suddenly realized, yes, but this is just a cycle. And anything you pick up right now is going to permeate into the dream state or the death state. And that if you can get wiser and wiser, even in the last 3 months of your life, it's going to change how your death state unfolds and what galaxies and universes and ethereal experiences you have there as you prepare to break into the physical again. This is so magnificent. You start understanding why spirituality is something that you take on for lifetimes. The Buddhists say for lifetimes. Enlightenment takes lifetimes. And that's so beautiful, because suddenly you don't meditate because you're frustrated that you need something right now, or you don't become wise because you hope to only have money now. You start to realize that you are actually creating this beautiful soul, like a gem. You know, if you've ever seen what a gem looks like when it comes out of the earth, an emerald doesn't look like what it does. It takes thousands of little cuts and polishes and to eventually look like that incredible thing. So we don't know where the eventual evolution of things are going, but I certainly know that there's an intelligence running through it, and that it is moral. And what I mean by moral is that it is absolutely run on the fabric of love. And because there is birth and death, like for the people that are on the front lines of watching the horrific side of suffering and the horrific side of birth and death, it can be very hard for them to stay connected to the fact that this is a divine expression. And sometimes what we all need to do, especially when we've been immersed in suffering or we have just experienced loss and we are in that absolute devastation, is we just need some quiet time to actually realize how freaking perfect this process is, and that we are each going to take our turn. And I have such a massive respect. I mean, I know that there's 3 people in this room that I can think of immediately, and we've got such a small room, got such a massive respect for people that are willing to be on the front lines of death, because it is a lot harder not to be depressed. It's a lot harder not to forget that this is just a beautiful unfoldment. It's like saying that in the beautiful winter into the beautiful summer, you will almost go to decide to spend most of your time in winter holding your hand out for people. And it sometimes begins to feel like it's a constant winter. And I know that's a strange analogy, but I think you guys know what I mean. Most people get constantly exposed to the sun and to the dark, and essentially people that decide to be the people that help people cross over, they get so much of that darkness and so much of that cold that they need an extremely, extremely tenacious soul, and their connection to God needs to become very, very deep. Otherwise, they themselves begin to feel quite lost. So that leaves us at the end. I just, personally, what I love about it is I don't think I've done it a particularly good job of my life. That's a personal thing. But what I love about it is it doesn't feel desperate to me, because I believe that I am on a very long process, and that every little thing I do and every little breakthrough I make makes a difference. I'm afraid of how I will die. I'm not looking forward to if it involves some suffering, but I always know that suffering is a very strange thing. I've had some things happen to me, and most of us have, that when we tell the story, it sounds horrific. And it probably wasn't nice at the time, but actually the person experiencing it is actually the one that copes the most. It's a very strange thing, that. And we see that a lot in cancers and things, that we are so much more, what is the word? Like, we're just so much stronger than people actually realize. And you are going to die. And preparing for your death is actually a daily thing. Even if you have never listened to this talk, you're actually preparing for death every day. Some of you are accumulating as much money as possible. Some of you are hoping that if you get enough cars and you get enough properties and you have enough children, that the death will eventually be okay. We are all building up some form of account and some sort of a way to be willing to let go at the end. We're all preparing for death daily. We just took it slightly deeper into conversation. And to me, there's no mystery. The mystery is only to me, how much of my identity will I take? So thank you for sitting with us. I'm going to end the conversation there from a recording perspective, and I will invite anyone to come in and share with us anything that they feel. And it doesn't have to be a question. It could be